At number 10 we have Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar. Latino people always have the best names. This guy sounds like he should be on the cover of some romantic novel, with long flowing hair and a chest you can raise a family on. Well, our possible heartthrob Carlos went missing back in 1995. A terrible time to get lost from society. The 90s were just taking off. His family sent out a huge search party for him and they could never find him. It took them a long time before they gave up, but eventually they had to call it quits, and in 2010 he was officially presumed dead. I guess you're only alive legally if people still have hope that you're out there. But in 2015 some mushroom pickers were doing the dirty work of, well, picking mushrooms near the coast of Tuscany, and they came across a forest man. This dude told the mushroom pickers that he had been in the forest for 20 years and that his name was Carlos and he was from Spain. Perfect match. His family came to come get him, but before they arrived he hid in the forest again. I guess you can say this guy was kinda half found. At number 9 we have Edgar LaTulip. This is basically the story of the longest vacation ever. Edgar LaTulip went down to the Niagara Falls when he was just 21. Edgar had struggled with mental health his whole life. His brain processed information very slowly and he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. Somewhere along the trip he bumped his head and got amnesia. It wasn't until he was in his early 50s that he remembered who he was, jumped on a bus and went back to his family. That is crazy. I thought amnesia was just something in cartoons. I thought it was a plot device to make sure that soap operas never got off the air. I mean, you could actually get hit in the head and forget everything? Like, who am I? Who are my friends? What are those plans I made that I wanted to flake on? I'm gonna remember that the next time I want to break up with someone. Like, I wanna love you, I just can't remember how. At number 8 we have Gabrielle Naki. Now this is a story about how my life got flipped turned upside down. That's pretty much what happened to Australia's Gabriel Naki. He was living a normal life until a couple guys who were up to no good started making trouble in his neighborhood. Well, actually he got into a car crash. Remember, road safety is very important. Well, Gabe got into the crash in 1987 and he was just gone after that. Police found his burned up car, but Gabe was nowhere to be found. His family went looking for him, but he never popped up. It was 20 years later that they were just about to give up hope when a dental record check confirmed he was still alive. The family sent an investigator to go find him, and sure enough, Gabe was still kicking around. What happened was that the car crash that Gabe was in was so traumatizing that he went into a fugue state, forgetting who he was. He lived around places, working odd jobs, until the private investigator came to come find him, showed him some pictures which jogged his memory, and then he went home to his family. At number 7 we have Judith Bello. We're gonna move over from a dude who became a forest person to an abandoned car that turned into a murder investigation. Judith Bello was married and a mom of 2 kids. She seemed to have a life that was all put together, until one day in 1993 when she went missing. Her car was left behind and the police immediately thought that she had been murdered. They launched an investigation, but they couldn't find anything, so it was a cold case file. I love that show. It wasn't until 18 years later when she popped up. She wasn't very far either. She was just 2 states over from where she went missing in Washington. And get this, she had a whole new family, new kids, new husband. She just hit refresh on her whole life. Control-Alt-Delete. The reason she took off and left her old family behind is because she was trying to escape her abusive husband. Judith though, you gotta take the kids with you, baby. At number 6 we have Hiro Onoda. So here's a huge one. This guy was fighting a war for over 30 years. Hiro Onoda was a Japanese soldier fighting during World War II. He was dropped into the Philippine jungles right before the war was over. So this guy was in the dense jungle while everyone was celebrating the end of the world's largest war. So he didn't get the memo that it was time to take a break, and he started his own guerrilla war in the Filipino jungles. The Japanese army even dropped flyers saying the war was over all over the jungle to tell him that he should leave, but he thought it was a trap. This guy was very high strung. It wasn't until 30 years later when an explorer by the name of Niro Suzuki went into the forest to find him. Niro was successful in finding him, but Hiro still didn't want to leave. So Niro notified the army, they sent in troops to go find him, and then finally relieved him. At number 5 we have Bo Bergdahl. Remind me to never sign up for the army. It's hard, people are super mean, and everything over there is scary. I'm gonna stay living in my air-conditioned apartment and order Uber Eats on my phone. Well, Bo Bergdahl was much more of a man's man than me. He was serving in Afghanistan in 2009 when he just went missing out of nowhere. Everyone thought he was dead, but it turns out he was kidnapped by the the Taliban. He was discovered in 2014 and Obama did some presidential stuff and arranged for his release. Bo was a prisoner of war for 5 years, not the ideal living situation. After he was rescued, it was discovered that the reason he was captured was because he tried to sneak over to another base and tell the sergeant over there how bad he was running his base. A classic case of mind your own goddamn business. At number 4 we have Lula Cora Hood. You know, I respect a lot of the people on this list. A lot of them just said, hey, I don't want to give up, or I don't want to live here anymore, and they just stuck to their word. With Lula, she had an argument with her husband and then dipped. She left in the 1970s and she was gone like a ghost, never seen again. It wasn't until 1996 when police contacted her family to tell them that they found Lula's body dead. Or was she dead? 14 years after that, in 2010, Lula popped up. She was living in Florida and she was now 80. On top of that, she was doing great. Apparently the argument was so bad with her husband that her husband told her to leave and never come back, and she was like, deal. I bet this argument was over one of those 14-hour games of Monopoly when you've been playing non-stop and then you find out someone was cheating. At number 3 we have Bakadendi Kakamov. I hope you guys heard me say that name the first time because I'm only reading that one out once. This dude was fighting in the Russian-Afghan war back in the 80s. While he was fighting, he took a bullet and some shrapnel and was in pretty rough shape. So the locals found him and then locked him in a dungeon waiting for him to die. No, I'm just kidding. They took care of him until he was healthy enough to leave. But the locals were so nice to him that he was like, I don't want to leave. You guys are dope. And he just stayed. He met a nice lady, he got married, he even started a family. And then he changed his name to Sheikh Abdullah. He must have been so nice finding love, making friends in the midst of war, and getting a name that people can actually pronounce. Later a veterans organization came looking for him, but he was an old dude and they just left him to chill like he had moved on.
Coming in at number 8 we have Elizabeth Smart. In 2002, Elizabeth Smart was taken from her home by a handyman that used to work for the family. The man was Brian David Mitchell, but went by Emmanuel to the Smart family. On June 5th, 2002, Brian broke into the family's home and kidnapped Elizabeth at knife point. Her sister, Mary Catherine, who was in bed next to her, pretended to be asleep to avoid being harmed. Brian and his wife then held Elizabeth captive for 9 months at a camp in the woods. It wasn't until October of 2002 when Mary Catherine recognized that the police sketches of the kidnapper looked an awful lot like their handyman, Emmanuel. As a result, he was captured by the police and Elizabeth was rescued from her kidnappers. Now Elizabeth is 32 years old and is a child safety activist, but her case still remains one of the most high-profile abduction cases in modern times.
Filling on number 7 saw is Edgar LaTulip. Now for some background, Edgar was mentally handicapped in a way which had him functioning as a 12-year-old kid. He had tried committing suicide multiple times, and in 1986 he had just been released from a hospital following his latest attempt, and he was put in a group home. One day he boarded a bus heading towards the south side of Lake Ontario and disappeared just like that, or so people thought. Since he had tried taking his life before, the first assumption his family had was that the 21-year-old had just killed himself.
But turns out that Edgar had suffered from a head injury that caused him to lose all of his memories. Similar to Gabriel's case, not knowing who he was, Edgar decided to make a new life for himself with a new name. 30 years later, Edgar started having weird flashbacks of his old life. He even remembered his real name. He shared this information with a social worker who then discovered that he was a missing person. DNA tests confirmed his identity, which means he essentially solved his own cold missing persons case, which is really cool.
Okay, I have a question with this.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's lost his memories.
Yeah.
But like, how do you realize at 21 years old, I don't know where he is, but he's like, oh, I don't know anything, let me just create a new life. Like, how do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I
like,
get
how
what
am
you're
I
saying.
like, how are you like, oh, I don't know anything, my name is Edgar now, like, or my name is Tim, like, I just don't get it.
Well, obviously, I think he like knows his basic things, but not.
Like, clearly not.
I don't know.
Like, you know what I mean? How'd you have a head injury and then wake up and be like, okay, I don't remember anything, time for a new life? I wouldn't even remember that I don't remember anything.
Just wander the streets.
Until someone told him, like, dude, are you okay?
Yeah, basically, it's sad. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the unidentified missing woman. Okay, this next case is actually quite hilarious. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Lindsay, missing people are not a laughing matter. I know. But wait till you hear about this case. So a woman was part of a group tour of an Icelandic volcano, but during the tour she decided to leave to, freshen up and change her clothes. That's when she was reported missing. But it doesn't stop there. This woman returned to her tour group and actually joined the search party looking for herself. The woman was described as Asian but fluent in English, about 5'3" and wearing dark clothes. Took her quite some time before she realized that she was also Asian, fluent in English, about 5'3", and was previously wearing dark clothes. That's when she announced to everyone that she was the missing person. So she quite literally found herself. Like, can you imagine that? People are out looking for you and you're like, oh, yeah, who are you looking for? Okay, I'll help. This woman actually seems an awful lot like me, huh? Hey guys, surprise, it's actually me, you know, like, it's actually funny.
Okay, at number 4, you guys, is Cora Hood, and this one is truly wild. Probably not as wild as that one though, because that was bloody hilarious. Illinois in 1917, argument at home caused Cora to leave her husband and kids and never return. Damn, can you imagine your mum just leaving the house to cool off after a fight and she just never comes back? Mommy issues as hell. Now, an intense search was underway, but she was never found. Then, in 1996, a full 16 years later, a skeleton was found that police thought was Cora's. A funeral was held and she was legally declared dead, but 10 years later, a DNA test proved the remains were not Cora. Plot twist.
The DNA test came back negative. The body they thought was Cora's was not. As a result, police reopened the case and started to search for Cora again, until they actually found her. For real this time. Turns out that she was in Jacksonville and claims that she left her family because she didn't know how to take care of her 4 kids. So she left and let her sister adopt them.
But I feel like surely there are better ways to handle that situation than
not just
disappear.
like, here sister, take my kids.
Can't handle this! Cora was found at 84 years old and her sons had already died by then. She didn't remember much, but at least she wasn't dead. But then again, who the hell's body was that they found?
True.
Who's that?
Whose body was that?
Who's that though?
Ooh. Dun, dun, dun.
Filling at number 3 slot is Hiro Onada. In the middle of World War II, 22-year-old Lieutenant Hiro Onada was deployed to Lubang Island in the Philippines on what was essentially a suicide mission. While there, most of his followers were captured or killed, but he and a few others managed to escape into the foothills. The group launched many guerrilla attacks on the locals, and they remained there even after Japan surrendered post the atomic bombings. Everyone had assumed Hiro was captured, missing, or dead, but even so, they airdropped leaflets into the area announcing that the war was over and to stop their attacks. The group thought this was all a trap by the US and continued fighting. By 1972, Onada was the only one left in there, but everyone presumed he was dead. An adventurer called Norio Suzuki went to search for him or his body and actually did find him in 1974. The lieutenant refused to surrender unless ordered to, like the man was still living in World War II 30 years after it ended. Can you imagine? Suzuki actually found Onada's elderly commanding officer and flew him to Lubang just to finally relieve the soldier. I'd be like, dude, do you not want to shower? Like, do you not want to go home and relax? Like, you've been through so much.
In our second spot, we have the Cleveland abductions. Between 2002 and 2004, a man named Ariel Castro kidnapped 3 different women. These women were Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Georgina DeJesus. They were held captive in Castro's home in Cleveland, Ohio until 2013. On May 6, 2013, Castro forgot to lock up Amanda Berry's door. This allowed her to run downstairs and alert one of the neighbors. The neighbor opened the front door for them and called the police. The girls were rescued and Castro was sentenced to life. But after being locked away for just a month, Castro took his life in his cell. And in our number 1 spot, we have Jamie Kloss. On October 15, 2018, Jake Patterson entered Jamie's family's home, killed her parents, and kidnapped her. Apparently, he became obsessed with Jamie after seeing her board her school bus one day. From there, he knew that that was the girl he wanted to take. Jamie was then held captive for 88 days.
She was forced to stay under Patterson's bed for 12 hours at a time and wasn't given a lot of food or water or even allowed to go to the bathroom. Patterson also put boxes filled with weights around the bed so that if Jamie moved in attempts to get out, he would know and then punish her. I remember how much news news coverage this case got, it was actually insane.
Yeah, I was following it.
Yeah, I was like, Jamie, we'll find you.
However, on January 10th, 2019, when her kidnapper left the house, Jamie mustered up enough courage to push the boxes away and escape his home. She approached a woman out walking her dog and immediately was taken to a neighbor's house and called the police.
Jamie was reunited with her aunt and uncle, who are now her legal guardians, and Patterson was caught and confessed to the murders and the kidnapping. Can you imagine escaping that whole ordeal, going through it to begin with, and then having to deal with the loss of your parents at the same time?
Yeah, she's strong. And the fact that she had enough courage to push away those boxes and just run. Whew.
Oh god.
It's scary.
Like it's like fight or flight, it's like now or never. This guy could kill me.
Starting off with number 10, Jaycee Lee Dugard. Jaycee Dugard is one of the most widely known cases of an abduction survivor ever recorded, with Jaycee getting abducted in 1991 by Philip Garrido and his wife Nancy, when Jaycee was just 11 years old. And Jaycee spent a huge portion of her life in captivity, being held by the couple for 18 years, even bearing 2 children. In 2009 is when things started to look up, as Garrido brought him and Dugard's children to the UC Berkeley campus. And when 2 campus officers felt that Garrido was suspicious, they ended up running a background check and discovering that he was a convicted offender, and that he was also in violation of his parole. They also noticed that he was not on record as having any children, which aroused even more suspicion. This is when police became involved and decided to arrest Garrido and his wife because of all the suspicions. They ended up also rescuing Jaycee and her 2 children, and since her release, she's been doing everything possible to have a normal life, even writing a best-selling book based on her experience called A Stolen Life. In at number 8, Robert McDonough. Back in 2013, Robert McDonough, who was a 73-year-old man with dementia, wandered out of his home in Maine. When his family realized he was missing, they quickly reported it to police, who then led a 14-hour search to find the man. And just when people were about to give up is when a miracle happened, and the next morning when ABC was about to report on the incident live outside of McDonough's home is when he ended up wandering right into the shop behind the reporter. And thankfully the reporter was then able to report a positive story, way different than he originally thought. And at number 7, Lucy Ann Johnson. Lucy Ann Johnson disappeared from her home in 1961, leaving her husband and 8-year-old daughter behind to wonder what happened to her. Many years later, in 2013, her daughter Linda wanted to reopen the case and placed an ad in the Yukon News about her mother. Then a woman named Rhonda ended up contacting Linda, saying that she was Linda's half-sister, and the missing woman Lucy was her mom as well. Because of this connection, Linda was then reintroduced to her mother after 52 years of being apart, telling her daughter that she ended up running away from their home because her husband had been harmful towards her. And at number 6, Edgar Latulip. Edgar Latulip was presumed dead after he disappeared from a mental hospital in 1986. Latulip was mentally ill, and he made several attempts on his life in the past, which made it an easy decision for the hospital to presume him as dead. But many years later, it was discovered that he wasn't dead, and not only that, but he was incredibly close to his home. It was discovered that he suffered a head injury, and that caused him to lose his memory. But roughly 30 years after his disappearance is when he started having flashbacks about his old life, and remembered his name, later sharing it with a social worker. Then after the social worker ran his name, they discovered that Edgar was a missing person and he was able to reunite with his loved ones. Halfway through at number 5, Winston Bright. The disappearance of Winston Bright was a very curious case, as he had left for work one morning but never ended up returning. This all took place one day in 1992, and after looking for him for many years, in 2000 a judge ruled that Bright was dead, and his wife ended up collecting his pension money, as she was entitled to it by law. Then out of nowhere, 20 years after he had disappeared, Bright ended up showing up at his wife's door, calling himself a completely different name, and also demanding his pension money from her. He ended up claiming that he had amnesia for 20 years, and then tried to win his pension from Verizon, the company that he worked for. But when all the facts were presented, it didn't look like anyone was buying his story, and a judge concluded that this man had just abandoned his family in hopes that he could come back many years later and collect a fat paycheck. But thankfully this didn't end up being the case, and he was denied all the benefits. In at number 4, Rick Hazelton. Rick Hazelton was found by a good friend who wanted answers about his disappearance. The New York man was declared dead after disappearing in 1986, but 3 decades later he was found after a childhood friend noticed a sketch of a man that looked incredibly similar to him in Nashville, Tennessee, and the friend Brian Pynchon enlisted the help of a retired officer from Nashville to help him track down the man. Hazelton said that one day he received a letter in the mail stating that he was being investigated as a missing person, and figured it was just some sort of mistake. Then 2 weeks later, police came to his door and confirmed confirmed the fact that the man was Rick Hazelton. Rick spoke of his disappearance, saying it was essentially just a big misunderstanding, telling the news that, quote, "I didn't think anyone really cared, so I just made my own life and did it." Then saying that after going around the country as a street performer, decided to settle down in Oregon with his family, where he has spent the last 20 years. Then adding the lack of technology made it a lot more difficult to keep in touch with loved ones, saying that he simply just fell out of touch with his family. And I guess I can see how you might fall out of touch, but after 30 years it's definitely a choice if you haven't at least tried to contact your family, right? Like, you'd think he would try something if he did want to talk to them, but up to him, I guess. In at number 3, Amanda Eller. Amanda Eller is a woman that went missing after she was hiking on a trail in the Mowako Forest Reserve on Maui, Hawaii. Eller was missing for roughly 2 weeks in the forest before she was rescued, and a helicopter came to airlift her out. She was found walking barefoot between 2 waterfalls and waving her arms. Apparently, Eller wandered deep in the Mowako Forest Reserve after she fractured her leg while hiking. She was reported missing the next day, and search parties were quickly sent after her. 2 weeks later, rescuers found her with minor injuries, 15 pounds lighter and in pretty good condition. It seemed that her career as a physical therapist and knowledge of yoga is what saved her life. In at number 2, Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar. Carlos is a man that did not want to be found, but even though he actively avoided it, it still ended up happening. After Carlos had gone missing for 1 day, many assumed the worst, as he had been depressed and had taken attempts on his life before. After vanishing in 1995, de Salazar was officially declared dead in 2010. Then close to 20 years later, 2 mushroom pickers who were wandering the coastline stumbled across his secret hiding place inside a nature reserve. Since the men were stunned by him, they decided to call for help. When a ranger arrived hours later, Salazar explained that he had been on the coast since 1997, and even though he begged Spanish officials to not tell his family and let him go back into hiding, they still contacted his family. But once they came to reunite with him, he was already long gone once again. And taking the top spot, we got Aaron Ralston, whose story of survival is so unique that there's a whole movie based off his experience, called 127 Hours. Ralston was climbing boulders in Colorado when he got caught and pinned under an 800-pound boulder. He stood there trapped for 5 days, during which temperatures dropped to 30 degrees. Then after 5 days of sitting and waiting with no food or water, he decided to take matters into his own hands, and ended up amputating his arm below the elbow. He then rappelled down in hopes of getting to the hospital fast enough to live. Hours after he'd been walking, he encountered 2 hikers in Horseshoe Canyon, and when they found him, they gave him water and called paramedics for him. Ralston's work had actually alerted the rescue crew of his disappearance, telling them that he hadn't shown up for work all week.
Coming in at number 10 is Lawrence Joseph Bader. At the time of his disappearance in 1957, Bader was in some hot waters financially, in trouble with the IRS, and with a wife who was due any day with the couple's 4th kid. Bader was overwhelmed by the world around him and believed there was only one thing he could do. So one night in '57, after paying the premium on his life insurance policy, Bader packed his suitcase, kissed his wife, and said he was going on a fishing trip. Next, he rented a boat, despite being warned there was a dangerous storm heading his way, and sailed off. The next day, the boat was found washed up on the shore, empty, with no sign of Bader or his luggage. After an investigation that proved fruitless, Bader was declared dead, and his family was devastated, but went on to live their life without him for the next 8 years. That was until his niece ran into a strangely familiar man who looked just like her supposed to be dead uncle. The man denied being who she thought he was, but later fingerprints confirmed that the man who went by the name Fritz Johnson was indeed the long-lost Lawrence Bader. But there was a twist. Bader, or Johnson as he now went by, had no recollection of his former life, and appeared to have suffered amnesia. But now found alive, his former wife was required to repay the life insurance and break off her engagement with the new beau since she was Catholic. Some say the amnesia was all an act, but he also had a sizable brain tumor that others believed could have caused the memory loss. Either way, it's a wild story. Coming in at number 9 is Timothy Carney. While on his way to work in September of 2004, Timothy realized he was running a little late and called his employer to let him know. But when he never showed up, his colleagues began to feel worried. Then later, after his car was found abandoned, family and friends of the 25-year-old began to fear that he may have been kidnapped, and began renting billboards,
pleading for his safe return home. Sadly, no such calls with his whereabouts were ever made, and eventually the case went cold. But 7 years later, the family got the strangest news, that their son's missing persons case had been cleared from the national database as he had finally been found. However, after a brief moment of relief, they were next informed that Timothy was not interested in speaking with them, nor would he permit that his location be revealed. While no one is quite sure exactly what he was doing while hiding out for 7 years, due to the fact that he's declined to go into detail, his parents suspect he got wrapped up with a local church that has on more than one occasion been accused of cult-like behavior. If that's true, he certainly wouldn't be the first victim of a cult that convinced its victims to stay away from their family. However, Timothy has allegedly denied the claims that his disappearance had anything to do with that. So really, who knows what the hell happened. Coming in at number 8, Lula Gillespie Miller. Soon after bringing her third little one into the world in 1974, Lula mysteriously signed her kids into her parents' custody, left her home, and walked off without a trace. Soon after she disappeared, her parents filed a missing persons report. Then, about a year later, in 1975, the family received a letter from Lula, and although relieved that she was alive, that was the last they heard from her for years. For the next 41 years, still considered a missing person by authorities, Lula stayed silent, away from her family and living her life. She never committed any crimes while in hiding, nor was she running away from any that anyone knew of, and so the great mystery of why a woman ran away from her life remained a mystery. Of course, there were many investigations over the 41 years that looked into her disappearance, some believing she had taken her own life, others believing she was kidnapped, until finally in 2016, authorities tracked her down in a small town in South Texas, where she had apparently been living since the 90s under an assumed name. Once found, Lula declined to give any explanation about her disappearance from her life in Indiana, but did grant her contact information to be given to her family so that they could reach out if they wanted to. Coming in at number 7 is Denise Bolser. When Denise Bolser's husband came home on January 17, 1985, he was horrified to find a threatening note that read, "We've got your wife," and immediately contacted the authorities so that they could start the investigation. A few days later, police discovered her husband's pickup truck abandoned at the airport with Denise's social security, birth certificate, and credit cards all inside. But things took a turn a few months later when a courier service where she worked as a bookkeeper accused her of embezzling nearly $100,000. And by 1986, police were able to charge her with the crimes in absentia, now putting together the puzzle pieces of this strange case. However, in one last twist, the embezzlement charges against her were dropped, leaving everyone just as confused as they were at the beginning. Fast forward 16 years, and a PI named Shirley Casey discovered that runaway Denise was hiding out in Florida under the name Denise James. And when authorities went to confirm the lead, they found out that Denise had started a whole new family that were completely unaware of her sordid past. Denise claims she ran away after her ex-boss threatened her life, drove her husband's truck to the airport, and never looked back. Coming in at number 6 is Michele Whitaker. After being dropped off at a truck stop by a friend in August of 2002, Michele vanished into thin air. At first, it was believed that her friend may have had something to do with her disappearance until one of her co-workers, Heather, disappeared 1 month later. Unaware of the connection with Michele at first, police immediately focused on Heather's boyfriend, Jonathan Vick, who happened to be a suspect from a previous unsolved SA case. But once they realized the connection between Heather, Michele, and Jonathan, they began to feel worried that they had a homicide case on their hands. Police began looking for any sign that Michele still could be alive, but her credit report and social security showed no activity for years, and although they didn't have any proof yet, they began to really worry that Michele had been killed. Then in the summer of 2008, 6 years after Michele disappeared, a woman was watching an episode of Forensic Files, and was shocked to see one of the victims of a killer featured on the episode was none other than her next door neighbor. Confused, she called the police to let them know that she was in fact alive and living in Oregon. In August of 2008, police officially announced that Michele had been found alive, apparently completely unaware that she had been the subject of a killing investigation. But why did she run away? Apparently, at the time she went missing, Michele had recently been arrested for a DUI and was mistakenly released early from jail, so she ran away to start a new life. Coming in at number 5 is Cynthia Ann Parker. By the early 1800s, European colonization was resulting in major population drop in indigenous villages. As a result, some territories resorted to kidnapping as a way to increase their numbers. One of the most famous was on May 19, 1836, during the Fort Parker Massacre, when 9-year-old Cynthia Ann Parker was taken from her Texas farm and brought to live amongst the Comanche. Now, as far as the Texans were concerned, Parker was missing for 20 years, and they continued to search for her at her father's request, but little to their knowledge, Cynthia had actually become completely assimilated among the village. When first brought in, she was adopted by a couple who raised her as their own, and eventually she married the chief, Petacuna, with whom she had 3 children. It is believed that Cynthia would have stayed with the Comanche until her dying days. However, in 1860, the Texas Rangers finally tracked her down, and believing that they were rescuing her, raided the village, killed her husband along with many other civilians, and brought Cynthia and her daughter back to her childhood home. Her reunion with her white family was not the storybook her father expected. She was angry that she was forced to leave behind her 2 sons, and never really assimilated back into white civilization. Banned from ever returning to the Comanche, Cynthia was forced to live the rest of her life under the supervision of her brother and uncle. Then, after her daughter died from pneumonia in 1864, with nothing else to live for, Cynthia slipped into a deep depression, eventually refusing to eat or drink until she died in 1871. Coming in at number 4 is Petra Pazitska. The year was 1984 when 24-year-old Petra went to the dentist and never returned home. As is often the case with disappearance of young women, police immediately feared and suspected that she had been killed, so a massive search for the college student began. For a while after her mysterious disappearance, Petra's case was featured on a true crime show, and then in 1987, a suspect for her homicide was found, or so they thought. The man, identified as Gunter K., confessed to police that he killed Petra, as well as another teen girl in the same part of Germany. Frankly, the police had no reason to believe he was lying, and even after he withdrew his confession, it was still believed he was the killer. By 1989, Petra was officially declared dead, and for the next 26 years, the world believed she died at the hands of Gunter K. That was until 2015, when a woman named Mrs. Schneider called the police after her apartment was robbed. But when she was unable to produce any ID, she eventually fessed up to being the missing woman. Evidently, she had managed to escape out of the public eye by never opening a bank account, or getting her driver's license, or a social security card. But because she hadn't actually committed any criminal activity, she couldn't be charged with anything. To this day, Petra refuses to explain why she went into hiding, and police say she was not interested in providing the public or her family with any further information. Coming in at number 3, B.K. Doe. In 2004, a Burger King employee discovered a naked man covered in fire ants sleeping next to one of the dumpsters in the alleyway. Disturbed and worried, the employee immediately called the police, who took the stranger to the hospital. Once admitted, hospital staff tried to get information from him, but he was unable to recall his name, so he was entered into hospital records as Burger King Doe. As the days went by, BK, as he was referred to, began to recall some things. He knew he had 3 brothers, and he knew his birthday was August 29, 1948. But still, his actual identity remained a mystery to him and everyone around him. Years went by, and he eventually named himself Benjamin Kyle and began living a new life. At one point in time, he was actually on the FBI's missing persons page, which was the first time the Bureau had ever put a missing persons report out for someone whose location was known. He even appeared on an episode of Dr. Phil. But no matter what Benjamin did, he began to lose hope that he would ever figure out who he really was. But incredibly, in 2016, a genealogist came to the rescue. As it turns out, Benjamin was actually William Burgess Powell, a man who had been missing since 1976. However, the mystery did not end there. Even though he now had a name, there was still a huge gap. He had already been a missing person for 28 years before he was found by the Burger King dumpster, and there was no record to show where he was all those years or why he disappeared in the first place. Coming in at number 2, Carlos Sanchez Ortiz. After receiving his medical degree in 1996, promising young Dr. Carlos, who secretly suffered severe depression, decided he'd had enough of the chaotic world around him and wandered off into the woods without any warning. But after a 14-year-long search by the Spanish authorities left them without answers, the case pretty much went cold and Carlos was officially declared dead in 2010. So imagine how the two mushroom pickers that were foraging a national park off the coast of Tuscany felt when they ran into him. Despite being missing for nearly 20 years and considered legally dead for 5, Carlos was in fact very much alive. He was just living his own life in solitude as far away from civilization as possible. Nervous that he might be dangerous, the hikers ran away to get a ranger and brought him back to the site. The ranger asked a few questions about who he was, to which Carlos showed an expired passport. However, Carlos was not looking to be found. In fact, he was quite annoyed and mentioned he was now going to need to move his camp so as not to be discovered by anyone else. And last up in our number 1 spot today is Jaycee Dugard. On the morning of June 10th, 1991, 11-year-old Jaycee was walking to the bus stop when a suspicious gray car pulled over and tased her until she was unconscious. This tragedy, of course, ensued a giant investigation, as well as multiple search parties, but as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into years, local authorities began to lose hope. Meanwhile, Jaycee was, in fact, alive, chained up in Philip and Nancy Garrido's shed in the backyard, and assaulted daily by her captor. At the time, Philip was on parole from a previous essay and kidnapping charge, but despite multiple visits from his officers, the backyard was never searched, and Jaycee remained hidden from the public. For the next 18 years, she was a prisoner, forced into bearing and raising 2 of Philip's offspring, and eventually gave up all hope of escaping her living nightmare. But one day in 2009, Philip, who I should also mention was a self-proclaimed evangelist, brought his and Jaycee's daughters on an excursion to Berkeley, attempting to organize a religious event on the campus. But the event manager felt that something was off with the man and how the girls were acting around him, so she got campus police to run a background check. It didn't take long before they figured out his history, and with that, his parole officer was immediately contacted. Thankfully, Dugard was rescued from her prison in the backyard, and the disgusting people that kidnapped and tortured her were sentenced to a lifetime in prison.
Number 10. Brenda Heist. On February 8th, 2002, Brenda Heist had just dropped her kids off at school. When the kids got home from school that day, they realized that the house was empty and their mom was nowhere to be found. The kids called their dad, who then called the police to file a missing persons report. 4 days after the report was filed, Brenda's car was found in a parking lot near a bus station in a neighboring county. Over the years, her husband was one of the suspects in the case. However, he passed a polygraph test and was ultimately cleared. In 2011, her husband had Brenda declared legally dead, but in April 2013, he received a phone call saying that Brenda had been found alive. According to reports, Brenda turned herself in on some outstanding warrants and then informed deputies that she was a missing person. Brenda told detectives that she had gone to a park on that February day to relieve some stress. While sitting on a bench crying, 2 women and a man befriended her and convinced her to join them while they were going to hitchhike to Florida. She decided to go and parked her car in the parking lot near the bus station. She spent the next 11 years struggling with addiction, working odd jobs in hotels, and living out of an RV. During the 11 years she had been missing, she had used a fake name, and under that name she had warrants out for many crimes. Number 9. Bo Bergdahl. Bo Bergdahl is a United States Army soldier who was held captive from 2009 to 2014 by the Taliban-aligned Haqqani network in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Bo was captured after deserting his post on June 30th, 2009. Bo, having expressed frustrations with American nationalistic attitudes within the army and disappointment in the US intervention in the Middle East, walked away from his platoon. He was eventually held as prisoner of war by the Taliban, though his capture has become a point of contention, since Bo initially claimed he fell behind on a patrol. The Taliban stated that they found him stumbling drunk, and US forces reiterated that he willingly left post. Missing and hidden for 5 years, Bo was brought back to the US in a trade deal made by the Obama administration. Number 8. Robert Hutton. Robert Hutton's family reported him missing in 1972 after they lost contact with him while he was traveling from New York to California. Although Robert led a nomadic lifestyle, his family became concerned when they did not hear from him. Despite efforts to track Robert down, authorities were not able to find him and eventually closed the missing persons case, believing him to be dead. At the point of Robert's disappearance, Wayne Gacy had been on the loose in Chicago area, where Robert was suspected to have passed through. As a young man who often worked at construction companies similar to Wayne's, Robert seemed a likely victim. But authorities found Robert alive and well in rural Montana, and he was delighted that his family was still searching for him. He claimed that he'd been living life without a fixed address and had lost his family's contact information. By the 1980s, Robert had settled down in Colorado, opening his carpentry business. He made a few efforts to contact his family, but failed to track them down. Robert was delighted to be reunited with his father and sister, and they were to have found him. Sadly though, his mother passed away without ever knowing that her son was alive. Number 7. Patricia Kopta. In 1992, at the age of 52, Patricia Kopta disappeared. At the time, she was known as the street preacher, nicknamed the Sparrow, because of her small build and had a history of mental illness. Her family believed she had died, but in 2023, she was found alive at age 93 at a nursing home in Puerto Rico. Patricia had been found wandering around northern Puerto Rico before she was taken to an adult daycare home in 1999, hinting that she had arrived via cruise ship. Eventually, Patricia, who has dementia, shared information with employees of the nursing home that led to details about her past. In 2022, the employees contacted the police and sent officials a DNA sample from her. It was a match to 2 of her relatives. Patricia and her husband Bob Kopta had been married for 20 years when she went missing. Bob, who never remarried, said he doesn't plan to visit his wife, but is happy that she's in a safe, caring place. She could have come home at any time. She always wanted to go to a warm climate, he said. They don't know how she ended up in Puerto Rico, but said she liked to vacation there. Unfortunately, Patricia's twin sister died before knowing that her sister had been found. Number 6. Steve Carter. Steve Carter didn't realize that he had been kidnapped until he was 35 years old. After reading a story about a similar case, he researched his own records out of questions that had bugged him his whole life. He then found a picture on a website depicting a digitally aged photo of a missing child marked Panama Barnes. When he saw it, he was in shock. The photo was his spitting image. Due to this, he contacted investigators and law enforcement, and he learned that his mother had run away with him when he was a baby. His father never located them because his mother changed their names. From there, his mother was checked into psychiatric care, and Steve became a ward of the state. His mother eventually disappeared yet again, but this time did not come back. He was then adopted by new parents at age 4. After this discovery, Steve reached out to his biological family, ending a lifetime of mystery, and I can't imagine the reaction of his biological father. Number 5. Wynn T. Van. One day, when Wynn T. Van was a teenager, she came home late. As a punishment, her mother locked her out of the house. Now, instead of sticking there, she went to a karaoke bar with her friends and met a woman who trafficked them. They accepted a ride and were offered some food, and they passed out after eating it. When she came around, she was in China. They were forced to marry older people in China, and without any knowledge about China or its language, Wynn could not think of how to get out or escape back to Vietnam. After being locked inside the house for a while, she was made to work and spent most of the time on farms. I cried all day, and every time I showed signs of wanting to get out, the man and his family would threaten to hurt me. I was so scared, I had to do whatever they told me to do, she said. During the 28 years in China, the only time she was allowed to leave the house was to go to the market. More than once, the family promised to send her home one day if she kept working, but that day never came. For many years, she believed she would die in China. She remained married to the man and then managed to escape. She then came home and shared this story with her parents, whom she is with today. Number 4. Steven Stainer. Steven Stainer was kidnapped when he was young by Kenneth Parnell. Kenneth had already been convicted of taking advantage of males, and Steven wasn't an exception. Kenneth reportedly took advantage of Steven, and he also changed Steven's name to Dennis Parnell and signed him up in several schools. Now, when Steven was getting older, Kenneth found him to be too old, and Kenneth abducted another boy named Timothy White. Steven didn't want to see someone else suffer
suffer the way he did for 7 years, and in 1980 he managed to escape and took Timothy with him. Sadly, Stephen was never able to get back to normal after his kidnapping. He turned into an addict to cope and died at 24 years old in a motorcycle accident. Number 3. Edgar LaTulip. Edgar LaTulip had developmental delays and mental health challenges and was off his medication when he disappeared in 1986. His family did know that he was headed for Niagara Falls though, and shout out to my hometown. Unfortunately though, people often go to Niagara Falls to end their own lives, and since he had some mental health issues, his family feared the worst. Shortly after arriving in the Niagara region, Edgar had sustained a head injury which drastically affected his memory. He couldn't recall who he was or where he had come from. With nowhere to go and no family to call, he ended up settling in the Niagara region under an invented identity. Then, 30 years later, in January 2016, while living in a group home, he suddenly remembered his real name. His social worker decided to research the name on the internet and found that a man named Edgar LaTulip had vanished. With that, they discovered that he was a missing person. They contacted the police, and his identity was later confirmed through DNA, and he was reunited with his family. Number 2. Michele Knight, Amanda Berry, and Georgina DeJesus. Commonly referred to as the Cleveland abductions, the story of serial kidnapper Ariel Castro broke headlines in 2013. For nearly 11 years, Michele Knight, Amanda Berry, and Georgina DeJesus were imprisoned by Castro, who repeatedly hurt and took advantage of them. They were taken between 2002 and 2004, and Amanda even gave birth to his child. Because the women were considered runaways by police, their case was never thoroughly investigated. It wasn't until 2013, when Castro's neighbor, Charles Ramsey, heard the 3 women crying for help inside the house, that officials realized that they were in fact not runaways. With the help of other neighbors, Charles broke down the cellar door and freed the women inside. Castro was charged with 4 counts of kidnapping and 3 counts of taking advantage of the women. He pled guilty to 937 crime counts as part of a plea bargain. He was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 1,000 years in prison without possibility of parole. And coming in at number 1 is Colleen Stan. In 1977, Colleen Stan was hitchhiking, and on that day in May, she had already turned down 2 rides. However, when a blue van pulled over, Colleen saw that it was being driven by a man who had his wife in the passenger seat and a baby in the back seat. Deeming the younger couple and their child a safe ride, she got in. The man was 23-year-old Cameron Hooker, and his wife was 19-year-old Janice Hooker. As it turned out, they had been actively looking for a hitchhiker to kidnap. Shortly after Colleen got into the van, Cameron forced her into a head box that weighed 20 pounds. The box, which only confined her head, blocked out sound and light around her and prevented the flow of fresh air. The car eventually drove to a house where Colleen was led downstairs, where she was tied to the ceiling by her wrists and was electrocuted, whipped, and burned. When the family moved to a mobile home, Colleen was kept in a coffin-like wooden box underneath the Hooker's bed for up to 23 hours a day, and she got the nickname of the girl in the box. Janice eventually confided in Colleen that she was brainwashed by Cameron and reported him to the police, where he was then arrested. At the trial, Janice testified against him for full immunity. Colleen's experience was described as unparalleled in FBI history. Cameron was found guilty and given consecutive terms, totaling a 104-year sentence. In 2015, he was denied parole, and it will be a minimum of 15 more years before he's eligible for parole again.